When we ignore these quintessential dimensions of humanity, we deprive people of ways to heal from trauma and restore their autonomy. It's the autonomy part, right? Because if you're a slave to your medication, it's your psychiatrist and your doctor and your insurance company. And if you ain't got no money and you're not privately insured, you getting the worst of the worst usually. It's really up to them. And when we don't create more avenues to understand that healing isn't just about the brain, it isn't just about feeling good, it isn't just about feeling bad. You just neglect, you deprive people of their ability to take charge of their own healing. That's why things like the World Health, I don't really want to get into this, but the World Health Organization be coming in trying to be like, let's give them a solution instead of seeing what solutions they already have and building upon it and giving the resources to it. We don't know if we drop it in and giving people solutions. And that's what, again, this whole chapter is really about. People need to take an active role in their healing. So today we're reading chapter 2 of The Body Keeps the Score, Revolutions in Understanding Mind and Brain. This is a big chapter because he goes in on the medical model that we currently are facing, right? We're experiencing very dispassionate care. And he's talking mostly, like, he was working in the 1960s, 1950s, right? All the way through, but it's still very wanting in care. When we're talking, a lot of the time when medical professionals are talking about people, they're talking about statistics. They're talking about people's illnesses. They're talking about people's conditions without honoring the wholeness of who the person is. That's actually, I think, a big problem with Western medicine, is that they try to treat just symptoms. They try to treat just behaviors. They try to treat just the surface level of what's going on without going deeper, right? And not treating a person as a person, and that their environment actually informs their brain chemistry as well, right? It affects it. They go together. And so seeing patients just as their labels, as their illness, is what he's talking about, the challenges and the problems with that. He talks about the pros and cons of the development of pharmacology. So being able to identify that mental illnesses are related to chemical imbalances in the brain. Like different serotonin levels are connected to different diseases. So depression has low serotonin levels, right? And like if you're super out of whack, it's cool to know that you can access the brain to try to fix it. So the pharmacology was actually trying to create solutions that way, because it's hard to deal with erratic behavior, right? If someone is going through something with their mental health and they are showing up in a way that is really hard to understand, thinking that we can understand their brain or giving them medication to help ease them, it's great. Of course, I would love to ease their suffering in that way. I feel like we'd all love to. But it's what he's talking about is it's helpful for some people, but it can't be the only approach. We can't just be taking medication. It has to be complemented by different other forms of healing, so that we can fully address the human. Again, it can't just be one approach. It's not just science. It's not just a science to healing people, right? There's a whole thing, a community. It takes a lot of resources. So those are two things. So dispassionate medical model we're in, learned helplessness. Let's see. He talks about the addiction to trauma, which is like reenacting traumatic events to repeat cycles and stuff like that. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then learned helplessness is probably one thing to really hit on. Yeah. I'm actually going to start with the learned helplessness one because, well, first I'm going to say, if you're not going to watch the whole video, here's a little quote for you to know what it was really about, what I took away from it. It's good to name things, right? It's good to acknowledge it, to identify, if you have a bunch of things, to identify a pattern, to identify a trend, to identify one thing you can label it as, so that you can put a handle on it. You can see it for what it is and work from there. You can ask questions of it. You can take it apart, put it together again, right? It's important to have a name for something. And from there, we can then, if we're talking about illnesses, then you can get somebody the help they need. If you don't know what's going on with somebody, you can't really help them, because then you're just throwing random shit at them. So it's really helpful for that. But we have to be really careful of how we use our labels to devalue others. Because a lot of the time when we're talking about mental illness, or we're talking about a label that we give to somebody, they're just that and nothing else, right? Because if you hear that I'm black, that actually doesn't mean you know anything about me, even as a black person, right? If I say I'm mixed, that doesn't also mean anything. You don't know anything about my experience. If we're taking it with mental illness, if I say I'm depressed, or if I have bipolar disorder, I'm schizophrenic, all these things, they actually don't reveal anything about me. Who is Gary to you? Just through that label, you're not going to know. And in fact, you're probably going to treat me a particular way. And so in the first part of the chapter, he's talking about when he was working at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center. And he's in a less medical role. He's more working recreationally with the kids, with young people, trying to make sure they stay involved in normal human things, you know, like relating to other people, going to pizza parlors, going to games, camping in a park, that kind of stuff. And so he got to see a lot of people outside of the medical space, right? Because doctors are trying to see everybody. Get in, get out, get in, get out. Okay, we sit down, go through the list. Okay, good, thank you. But he got to like really sit with people. And he's doing this late night thing, late night ward. So he gets to really hear people's traumatic stories. All these people who are going through a lot of things, they all have a lot of traumatic stories, he comes to find out. And again, this is about this man. This whole book is really this man's journey into understanding the relevancy, the frequency, how many people have trauma, and like how much it impacts us. But as he learns so much about people being neglected, assaulted, abandoned, harmed as children, even witnessing violence in their families, but such experiences seem to be off the table during rounds. So when he's talking with the administration, when he's talking with the staff about how to treat these people, but we're not talking about the stories that he's learning about these people, because they're discredited as crazy. That's another thing we gotta be careful. When we devalue people because of their labels, usually it's because we think they're crazy. A schizophrenic person is crazy, so we don't listen to what they say. They could be lying, right? We don't know what's going on. So it's off the table, but it's crucial. You need that information about their upbringing, about how they're experiencing themselves, their memories, their bodies, to know how to treat them fully. I was often surprised by the dispassionate way patients' symptoms were discussed and by how much time was spent on trying to manage their suicidal thoughts and self-destructive behaviors rather than on understanding the possible causes of their despair and helplessness, right? I was also struck by how little attention was paid to their accomplishments and aspirations, whom they cared for, loved, or hated, what motivated and engaged them, what kept them stuck, and what made them feel at peace, the ecology of their lives. This is a stuff that's a whole view of a person, right? We gotta know, like, you gotta know what makes a person shine, not just what makes them feel shitty, because you don't know them if you just know when they feel shitty, and you're only looking at them through that lens. And here's a story I'm not gonna read it, but he told a story about he had to administer electric shock treatment for people who had depression. That's what was going on at the time. This is 1960s. He's working here. And so there was this one woman who had been admitted to receive electroshock for depression. Being my curious immigrant self, I looked up from the charts to ask them about their lives. Many of them spilled stories about painful marriages, difficult children, and guilt over abortions. As they spoke, they visibly brightened and often thanked me effusively for listening to them. Some of them wondered if they really still needed the electric shock after having gotten so much off their chests. All they needed was somebody to talk to listen to their story, right? And they felt better. I always felt sad at the end of these meetings, knowing that the treatments that would be administered the following morning would erase all memory of our conversation. I did not last long at that job, so he left because there's a whole lot. Like, to see that him talking to people is actually helping, but we're opting for this other thing because that's what has been said is the way to treat these people. And this is why it's important that the medical industry adapts to understand trauma, to understand people as people, not just as subjects and patients. Something he says later on toward the end, the brain disease model, so looking at the brain as something that is disease, takes control over people's fate out of their own hands and put doctors and insurance companies in charge of fixing their problems. And we'll say there's one thing he closes out the chapter with that I'll say for the end of the video because I just think it's so good. And then here we're going to move into something else that's so good. He talks about his greatest teacher, Elvin Semrad, who is a Harvard professor. Was he also a doctor? One thing he said that I love, this is his introduction into him. I remember asking him once, what would you call this patient? Schizophrenic or schizoaffective? He paused and stroked his chin, apparently in deep thought. I think I'd call him Michael McIntyre, he replied. Right? We don't gotta call people by their stuff. Like, call them by their name. Semrad taught us that most human suffering is related to love and loss, and that the job of a therapist is to help people acknowledge, experience, and bear the reality of life with all its pleasures and heartbreak. The greatest sources of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves, he'd say. urging us to be honest with ourselves about every facet of our experience. He often said that people can never get better without knowing what they know and feeling what they feel. And healing is based on experiential knowledge, right? Healing, he told us, depends on experiential knowledge. You can be fully in charge of your body only if you can acknowledge the reality of your body. Oh, you can be fully in charge of your life only if you can acknowledge the reality of your body in all its visceral dimensions. And just a little sidebar about healing is based on experiential knowledge. Something else my coach once said, Sean Smith, that knowledge is just a rumor until it's in the body. You can know something about yourself, right? You can know that you're loved. You can know, it can be light, right? There's deep knowings of things, and there's things we kind of lightly know. But it's usually in the experience when you have to show up in a particular way, when you're going through particular experiences that you really know something, right? Like, I didn't know I could do van life until I did it. And now I know that I'm resourceful. I know that I am trustworthy of myself, that I understand my capacity, that I love myself and I care about myself. I had struggled with that a long time. Right? Like, I always thought because I made poor choices, or because I didn't eat a particular way, or because I thought particular things about myself, that I didn't love myself. But in going through this experience, this new experience, and showing up for myself, and learning how to deal with my triggers, and breathing and being with it, that's when it got really real for me. That I was like, oh, huh. And what I love what he says about you have to acknowledge the reality of your body in all its visceral dimensions. A lot of the time when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about something that was so intense that it bypassed your thinking brain, your rational mind, your conscious mind. And it's just your body who took the brunt of it, right? Took the impact, and it's now imprinted on your body. So a lot of healing actually has to do with feeling big feelings again, feeling those scary feelings again, feeling again. If you feel numb, feeling is really it's going to be scary, but that's also what you have to learn, that it's safe to feel, right? You got to be able to be in your body, feel your body, because this is what houses your, it's not who you are entirely, right? This is our avatar, but it also houses our soul. So you have to have a relationship with your body, right? And that's the thing that's scary about trauma, is it breaks connections first with ourselves and with others. So healing is then about learning how to come back into the body, right? How to be in connection with yourself. One thing he says that's really cool is, like, medicine has always approached human suffering based on the technology that was available. So before the Enlightenment, aberrations in behavior were ascribed to God, sin, magic, witches, and evil spirits. It was only in the 19th century that scientists in France and Germany began to investigate behavior as an adaptation to the complexity of the world. So before, so anger, lust, pride, greed, avarice, and sloth, those are the 7 deadly sins, as well as a bunch of other problems, were recast as disorders. So not in the order, right? It's out of order, like disorganized. That could be fixed by the administration of appropriate chemicals. Many psychiatrists were relieved and delighted to become real scientists, just like their med school classmates who had laboratories, animal experiments, right? Because before that, if anger and greed and depression and schizophrenia were because of God is cursing you, or if it's because of evil spirits, then there's not much we can really do for you because it's out of my hands, right? But when it's now cast not as a moral thing and God is not cursing you, but that you have a brain disorder, like there's a chemical imbalance in your mind, now it's like, actually there's hope, right? We can build to finding a solution. Maybe if we know that the cause of mental health is considered a chemical, considered an aberration of the brain, a chemical imbalance, and that all we have to do is balance the brain, right? And like he said, in 1973, he was very excited to join the pharmacological revolution, because it's like now a new way to help these people, right? And actually, antipsychotic drugs were a major factor in reducing the number of people living in mental hospitals in the United States from over 500,000 in 1955 to fewer than 100,000 in 1996. So that's huge, right? Because administering medication for people, it did help them. Some people really just needed an extra lift in their serotonin. Some people really just needed their alarm systems to calm down, to calm the amygdala down. We'll talk about brain next chapter. But, those things were useful for them. And that was good. But it's not for everybody. Later on, he talks about how Prozac doesn't even really affect PTSD folks. So a lot of veterans who, when they did a test for Prozac for some people, that really helped them a lot. And when they tested it on combat veterans at the Veterans Administration, their symptoms were unchanged. And they don't even really know why, because it is a chemical imbalance, but clearly there's something else that's going on too. You know, there's something larger that's happening. Oh, hey Liz. My friend did this amazing thesis on neoliberalism's influence on concepts of sin, self, and psychology. Ooh, yes, do let me know about that next time. I love it. Hello, y'all. Yeah. So, you know, pharmaceutical drugs are not the end all be all. You can't use them as the only solution to everything that's going on, but also they're an important part for if you have a dysregulated neurological system, right? Chemical system inside your body, you need to apply more than just talking, right? You need to apply more than just running, more than just yoga. You also need to maybe apply medication. You know, I don't know. He don't know either. He's just saying you got to figure out, but it's not just one solution. Okay, and then here we'll talk about an important concept. Okay, this one was probably one of the most impactful things of this part of the book. Inescapable shock. This is a concept we'll consider, or also known as learned helplessness. If y'all have ever heard of that, we're gonna learn about where it came from. So there was two psychologists. I forget. I don't see the other person's name. Oh, Stephen Mayer of the University of Colorado and Martin Seligman of University of Pennsylvania. The topic was learned helplessness in animals. So those two scientists they took dogs, put them in locked cages, and shocked the cage. This is where we get to the first controversial animal thing. There are some animal experiments that they talk about in this. And like he said, being a dog lover, I realized I could never have done such research myself, but I was curious about how this cruelty would affect the animals. And this is a dicey part of science too, right? We don't want to have to, if you watch Futurama, the professor says science would not be able to move forward without piles of dead monkeys, right? And that's grim. But also we have learned so much about animals. So let's acknowledge, thank you animals for helping us learn so much about ourselves. But so they took the dogs, put them in locked cages, shocked the cage. And they called this condition inescapable shock. The cage is locked, the dogs are in there, they're being shocked, right? After several courses of this, they open the gates and they shock the dogs again. Nothing happened. Then they brought in control dogs, right? Yes, thank you, animals. They brought in control dogs who had never been shocked before. And when they shocked the cage, those control dogs did, right? But what was shocking is that the dogs who had been subjected to the inescapable shock made no attempt to flee even when the door was wide open. They just lay there whimpering and defecating. The mere opportunity to escape does not necessarily make traumatized animals or people take the road to freedom. Like Mayer and Seligman's dogs, many traumatized people simply give up. Rather than risk experimenting with new options, they stay stuck in the fear they know. That gives me chills, I think, every time I read it. Because I think this is so important, where we have to really honor the fact that trauma is not in the brain. It's not all in your mind. It's not just because you don't care enough about yourself and you don't want to heal. You don't want it that bad. It's not because you're broken, right? But it's a conditioning. It is a conditioning of what do you do when you can't run out of a cage that is being shocked? You give up, And so I think this really is an important thing that I keep coming back to in this book too. And this is why when we understand trauma, we can learn all about it, but there's a compassion that needs to be part of it. And this is what he's talking about with the medical field, right? The medical industry is not compassionate. It's very cut and dry. It's very, you got this and that's all I'm treating, but we're not going to talk about your whole experience. But you have to have compassion that just because you open the door and you provide you see this way, it doesn't mean people are going to take it. In fact, the only way to teach the traumatized dogs to get off the electric grids when the doors were open was to repeatedly drag them out of their cages so they could physically experience how they could get away. So it is actually, someone else had to physically pull them out of their helplessness to be able to even understand a different reality could exist. Right? And that's big. That's really big. Because just because freedom is there doesn't mean we'll take it. We have to be taught how to take freedom, how to take steps toward saving ourselves. And he says here, scared animals return home regardless of whether home is safe or frightening. I thought about my patients with abusive families who kept going back to be hurt again. Are traumatized people condemned to seek refuge in what is familiar? If so, why? And is it possible to help them become attached to places and activities that are safe and pleasurable? Right. The conditioning with consistency is insane. Yes. And so then he moves into this piece about talking about repeating cycles. So being addicted to trauma almost, right? It's like these patients often complain about a vague sense of emptiness and boredom when they are not angry, under duress, or involved in some dangerous activity. Thinking about if you feel huge, right? If you have a huge experience that overwhelms your experience, your ability to cope, that is deep feeling. Those are big feelings. And so anything under that is probably pretty mellow, just like based off of exposure, right? If you, I don't know, it feels like it makes a lot of sense, you know? And so if your life is dull and you feel numb, or you feel apathetic, or you feel not connected, you know, if you don't feel these things, then of course we're going to want to feel things, feel sharp things, feel big things, right? So he was saying they decided to learn more about attractors, the things that draw us, motivate us, make us feel alive. Normal attractors are meant to make us feel better. So why are so many people attracted to dangerous or painful situations? And they had a study that explained how activities that cause fear or pain can later become thrilling experiences. They've shown how the body learns to adjust to all sorts of stimuli, right? We know that. The body be adjusting. That's really what we're good at. We may get hooked on recreational drugs, because they right away make us feel good, but activities like sauna bathing, marathon running, or parachute jumping, which initially cause discomfort and even terror, can ultimately become very enjoyable. This gradual adjustment signals that a new chemical balance has been established within the body, so that marathon runners, say, get a sense of well-being and exhilaration from pushing their bodies to the limit. I myself have never experienced this alleged runner's high. But there is that feeling that people get when you push yourself, right? It's, again, about the extremes. It's about feeling to these extremes. Something that Freud called these things was traumatic reenactment. It's almost like a compulsion to repeat. You're going over and over trying to heal what was broken through reliving it, but it ends up actually creating usually more pain and self-hatred, right? Because you're trying to close this loop, but you haven't learned it, because if you're in the cage, you have not learned, or maybe they took you out the cage, but they didn't really teach you how to be outside, right? So now you're running this loop trying to close it, but you can't. And so you go seek these emotions that will spike your endorphins so that you feel alive, right? I'm going to go jump off a plane because I feel alive. And most of the time I feel like dying, or I don't feel like doing anything, right? So it makes a lot of sense. And then there was a statement, right? Strong emotions can block pain. So they did an experiment where they took some 8 Vietnam combat veterans. They showed them they did a standard pain test. This is the body keeps the score. Yeah. The first clip we showed was from Oliver Stone's graphically violent Platoon, 1986. And while it ran, we measured how long the veterans could keep their right hands in a bucket of ice water. We then repeated this process with a peaceful and long-forgotten movie clip. Yeah, I don't even remember what movie that was, the second one. 7 of the 8 veterans kept their hands in the painfully cold water 30% longer during Platoon. We then calculated that the amount of analgesia, I guess it's something in the brain, produced by watching 15 minutes of a combat movie was equivalent to that produced by being injected with 8 milligrams of morphine, about the same dose a person would receive in an emergency room for crushing chest pain. So these folks these veterans watching a violent movie with their hand in cold water could stay in cold water longer than when watching a peaceful movie with their hand in the cold water. Because strong emotions can block pain, right? And he says the explanation, right, is that it releases morphine-like substances, right? Because but you're engaged in something, so it almost dulls it. So it suggests that for many traumatized people, re-exposure to stress might provide a similar relief from anxiety. So again, when we're feeling these spikes in emotions again, it's like I feel alive, so I feel not those other bad feelings or shame or, numbness that I'm feeling present in this time. And he's saying how it's an interesting experiment and it tells a lot, but it doesn't actually fully reveal why people keep going back and keep enacting these things. It kind of gives a chemical understanding, but it doesn't fully make sense that you would still go back into these harmful situations, right? Because it's more complex than that. And then in this part of the book, he talks about the actual brain chemistry stuff. I'm not going to get super into it, but one thing I thought was fascinating is animals with low serotonin levels were hyperactive to stressful stimuli, like loud sounds, while higher levels of serotonin dampened their fear system, making them less likely to become aggressive or frozen in response to potential threats. So animals with low serotonin levels are hyperreactive to loud sounds and stressful things. Well, the ones that have higher serotonin levels are less afraid and actually able to respond to a threat, not from a fight spot and not from a freeze spot. Right. This struck me as an important finding. My patients were always blowing up in response to small provocations or felt devastated by the slightest rejection. I became fascinated by the possible role of serotonin in PTSD. Other researchers had shown that dominant male monkeys had much higher levels of brain serotonin than lower-ranking monkeys, but that their serotonin levels dropped when they were prevented from maintaining eye contact with the monkeys they had once lorded over. In contrast, monkeys who were given serotonin supplements emerged from the pack to assume leadership. So what's going on in that is the monkeys, animals have ranking systems, right? They have orders and stuff. So monkeys that are leaders have higher serotonin levels. That's what they kind of noticed, right? They just had them much higher, the dominant monkeys. And the ones that were lower ranking, they did not have as much serotonin. When they prevented the dominant higher serotonin monkeys from maintaining eye contact with the lower ones, their serotonin levels dropped. In contrast, when they gave the lower ranking monkeys that have lower serotonin supplements to boost it up, they actually showed up as leaders. So serotonin has something in how we show up. There's a connection between serotonin levels in our body and how we show up. Point blank, period. And as he says, the social environment interacts with brain chemistry. Manipulating a monkey into a lower position in the dominance hierarchy made his serotonin drop, while chemically enhancing serotonin elevated the rank of former subordinates. Fascinating, right? So this is all he's talking about here is the evidence that was used to really substantiate and make pharmacology solid, right? Pharmaceuticals are useful because these things are true. Right? There's something that's going on with serotonin and how we show up. There's something going on with our internal neurotransmitters and internal chemicals that affects how we show up and how those behaviors show up, right? And so he talks about how Prozac works for a lot of folks that, who's working with a woman who was struggling with, she had childhood abuse, who is now struggling with bulimia. And then she reported after doing it, I had a very different last few days. I ate when I was hungry. The rest of the time I did my schoolwork. It was one of the most dramatic statements I had ever heard in my office. But what was fascinating is when they took that and they applied it to combat veterans, their PTSD symptoms were unchanged. Hello now. Now this is interesting, right? Because if everything is about a brain imbalance, what's going on with PTSD that Prozac would not change your serotonin? So it's not just, so I think what that, for me, because he says nobody's ever really been able to explain this, and I cannot accept the most common explanation that receiving a pension or disability benefits prevents people from getting better. After all, the amygdala knows nothing of pensions. It just detects threats, right? They're trying to say that socially is why, but clearly something else is going on. And that's what, again, this book is like making a case for trauma. Trauma is its own thing to study. It's in addition to, yes, it offsets your brain, right? It changes the way you think, how you see the world, your very capacity to think and imagine and be curious about the world. But there's also something going on that's different than just a serotonin imbalance, So just really fascinating. When he's talking about the brain disease model, I think I read this line actually, takes control over people's fate out of their own hands and puts doctors and insurance companies in charge of fixing their problems. If indeed they were as effective as we were led to believe, right? Like antidepressants, this is his example, depression should by now have been a minor issue in our society. Instead, even as antidepressant use continues to increase, it has not made a dent in hospital admissions for depression. The number of people treated for depression has tripled over the past 2 decades, and 1 in 10 Americans now take antidepressants. You know what he's saying? So he's trying to be like, it all started so purely. We really wanted to help people. We really wanted to invest all the resources we could into, oh, it's a brain disorder? Okay, great. Now we could do it like science. But we also forget that science is often very socially informed, right? As he says here, yeah, actually speaking of that, that's perfect. Children from low-income families are 4 times as likely as privately insured children to receive antipsychotic drugs. These medications often are used to make abused and neglected children more tractable, right? So it will make them more manageable and less aggressive, but they also interfere with motivation, play, and curiosity, which are indispensable for maturing into a well-functioning and contributing member of society. So a lot of these drugs are neutralizing people, making them, they can't even function. They're in a fog state. But it makes it, oh, well, I mean, they're not having the other thing anymore. But it's not the only way, is what he's saying. He's like, the theory that mental illness is caused primarily by chemical imbalances in the brain can be corrected by specific drugs, has become broadly accepted by the media and public, but they should only be considered as adjuncts, additions to our overall treatment, right? It's not just going to, again, just talking about it isn't going to heal it. Just naming your trauma isn't going to heal it. Just taking drugs isn't going to heal it. It has to be a combination of things, right? And we haven't even talked about bringing in the body. That's his part 5. That comes much later in this book. So this is the part I wanted to close out on and read. It's also like the last part of the chapter. The brain disease model, so this idea that the brain is diseased and we can fix it, overlooks 4 fundamental truths. 1, our capacity to destroy one another is matched by our capacity to heal one another. Restoring relationships and community is central to restoring well-being. 2, language gives us the power to change ourselves and others by communicating our experience, helping us to define what we know, and finding a common sense of meaning. 3, we have the ability to regulate our own physiology, including some of the so-called involuntary functions of the body and brain, through such basic activities as breathing, moving, and touching. And 4, we can change social conditions to create environments in which children and adults can feel safe, where they can thrive. When we ignore these quintessential dimensions of humanity, we deprive people of ways to heal from trauma and restore their autonomy. It's the autonomy part, right? Because if you're a slave to your medication, it's your psychiatrist and your doctor and your insurance company. And if you ain't got no money and you're not privately insured, you're getting the worst of the worst usually. It's really up to them. And when we don't create more avenues to understand that healing isn't just about the brain, it isn't just about feeling good, it isn't just about feeling bad, you just neglect, you deprive people of their ability to take charge of their own healing. That's why things like the World Health, I don't really want to get into this, but the World Health Organization be coming in trying to be like, let's give them a solution instead of seeing what solutions they already have and building upon it and giving the resources to it. We don't know if we drop it in and giving people solutions. And that's what, again, this whole chapter is really about. People need to take an active role in their healing. And as he said at the start of it, when he was able to just listen to people's stories, he watched them visibly lighten and brighten. And that's important. That's an important aspect of it. Yes, decolonize mental health. Being a patient rather than a participant in one's healing process separates suffering from their community and alienates them from an inner sense of self. Given the limitation of drugs, I started to wonder if we could find more natural ways to help people deal with their post-traumatic responses. Because exactly, active role in your own journey, you need that. That's how we actually come back into the body. So 2 takeaways that I'll say for this chapter, maybe 3. So we'll go back to the first one I said, which is good to name things. It's important for us to have the language to name our experience so that we can work with it better. But we also have to be careful of how we use the labels, especially when we're using them to devalue or just focus on one part of a person. Because again, if you know that I have depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, you know nothing about me. You just know some word that we all learned, It doesn't actually mean anything about my dreams and who I am as a person. So that's the first thing I would say. We need to take a whole look at the person. What else was I going to say? God damn it. That it's important, restoring relationships and community, right, is really important. It's actually about coming back into connection with people. It's not about healing in isolation. And your doctors, if they're not asking you other questions aside from your problems, they're probably not looking at you as a whole person, right? And that's not just your doctor's fault. It's just the way the system has been set up. And so we need a little shift in that. And the other thing I would say is, like, this is something he's going to keep coming back to, but right, being present to the visceral truth of our body. We need to know what we feel, because a lot of the times, again, trauma has you acting. Oh shit, my phone is dying. But trauma will have you, it's how you responded when your body was overwhelmed, right? Your body took it. You left somewhere, maybe, right? Overwhelmed. So it's your body who's processing it. So it's so healing to just come back and know what's in the body. And really, it's all about making the body a safe space again, a safe space to experience life and reconnecting those lost connections, those broken connections. So that's chapter 2. We in it still. Chapter 3 is looking into the brain. This part, y'all, the Neuroscience Revolution, this is crazy. He got pictures of the brain and stuff, right? It gets into just like what each part of the brain does and what trauma does to offset it. I'm going to probably have to read this over pretty deep, because it's just, I want to get the words right and, and have y'all be clear about what I'm talking about too. But it's really awesome to understand how trauma will set off different parts of our brain, right, in different ways. And that's what we need to learn. That's what we have to recognize, that our brain changes with trauma. It gives us, I think it just gives me so much more compassion to think about, oh wow, when your brain is really thinking about perceiving everything as a threat, it changes everything, right? Your stress hormones are crazy. Yes, please get the book. Yeah, I never said that. A call to action for y'all is, if you have this book or you want to get it, please get it. And we're going to go through it together. I'm reading this for a book club with some folks, and I'm on chapter 15. But I'm now, because we're in the last part of the book, I'm going back to go through it again, because it's just such a good book, and it's something that I know I need to read twice. Thank you very much. And I love that, Bree. I appreciate you. Love to do this with you too. So anybody who wants to join in too, come through, read the book together with us. And yeah, I'll see y'all. I'm not going to say tomorrow, just in case I want to do it on Sunday. But within the next 2 days, I got y'all with chapter 3. So have a wonderful day. Oh, I guess I'll leave you with a question. What, and I'll write it in the post too, which is, what recently have you been engaging in, or maybe it just happened once or twice, that made you feel alive in your body, fully present in your body? And it can be explicit if you want, get as personal or whatever you want. But I'm curious about that. And I love to hear from y'all. So talk to you later. Have a great day.